Many years from now, there is going to be a quiet crisis, loneliness in women especially. Not because women failed, not because they weren't capable or intelligent, but because they were handed a script or a blueprint that left out the consequences. Be self-sufficient, put your career first, you don't need a man. So they followed it. They pushed love down the line. They delayed the family. They treated commitment like something that could always wait until it didn't. Fast forward a few years later. You're older, no partner, no children, no legacy, just some noise to fill that silence. Meanwhile, your grandmothers had way fewer choices, but way stronger direction. They built families, they built the roots, they built something bigger than themselves. And this generation swapped it all for convenience. Legacy for pleasure, meaning for freedom without structure. And here's the part that nobody likes to talk about. The men that they overlooked in their 20s, they didn't just vanish. They were building, failing, learning, becoming disciplined, and becoming men. Men don't peak early. They compound with time. Value grows with time and skill and responsibility. Women don't gain leverage by delaying everything. That is not cruelty. That is reality. Every decision comes with a cost. Modern narratives today did not remove the bill. They just postponed it. And the outcome is usually the same. Distractions instead of connection. Comfort instead of intimacy, and independence without fulfillment. This is not about going backward. It's about correcting the course. We don't need less ambition. We need stronger values, commitment, family, masculine leadership, feminine devotion, and a shared purpose, because freedom without foundation doesn't liberate. It isolates you completely. And tradition wasn't the problem. Abandoning it was.
We are living through a moment in history that most people feel, but very few can clearly explain. Something fundamental has changed in how people relate to one another, how trust is formed, and how connection is built. What once felt natural now feels strained, awkward, and uncertain. And the cost of that shift is showing up everywhere in society. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to break down explains why so many people feel lonely, disconnected, and unsettled, and why this did not happen by accident. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. Your support helps this channel reach more people who are trying to make sense of what is happening around them. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. Angry's Crypto Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a practical and straightforward way. And the academy is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. That support goes a long way in keeping this content coming. Now let us begin. What we are witnessing right now is not just a rough cultural phase or a temporary social trend. We are watching the slow breakdown of human connection, especially between men and women, and the consequences are far more serious than most people are willing to admit. This breakdown did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without cause. It is the result of decades of messaging, policy changes, cultural shifts, and personal choices that gradually rewired how people see one another, what they expect from relationships, and how much risk they are willing to take in forming them. For a very long time, there was an assumption baked into modern culture that men would always adapt, always comply, and always remain available. The belief was that no matter how men were treated, no matter how often they were told they were not needed, not wanted, or not welcome, they would continue to pursue relationships, continue to provide, and continue to carry the weight of social stability. That belief turned out to be wrong. For over 50 years, men were told directly and indirectly that they were the problem. They were told their instincts were dangerous, their presence was intrusive, and their traditions were outdated. Male-only spaces were dismantled or heavily scrutinized. Spaces where men bonded, learned discipline, formed friendships, and developed identity were slowly erased or transformed beyond recognition. This did not just happen in one area of life. It happened in the workforce, in social spaces, in recreational environments, in clubs, in organizations, and even in spaces designed specifically for boys to grow into men. At the same time, ordinary interactions between men and women were reframed as risky. Approaching someone, starting a conversation, or expressing interest became something that required constant calculation. What used to be normal human behavior was recast as potentially harmful or inappropriate depending on interpretation. Men learned very quickly that the cost of misunderstanding or misreading a situation could be severe, even if their intentions were harmless. Over time, men adjusted their behavior. At first, they became more cautious, then more reserved, then more withdrawn. Eventually, many of them simply opted out, not out of bitterness or anger, but out of self preservation. They discovered something unexpected in that withdrawal: peace, quiet, stability, a sense of control over their own time and emotional energy. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. Men did not leave society because they were incapable of adapting. They left because adapting no longer made sense. When every interaction carried risk and little reward, when effort was met with suspicion, and when commitment offered diminishing returns, walking away became the most rational choice available. Now, years later, the cultural consequences of that decision are becoming visible. Social media is filled with people expressing confusion and frustration about why dating feels broken, why connection feels rare, and why loneliness seems to be everywhere. Many women openly ask why men no longer approach them, why dating apps feel empty, and why forming lasting relationships feels harder than ever. The irony is difficult to ignore. For decades, men were told not to approach, not to initiate, and not to assume interest. They were told to stay away, to leave women alone, and to stop engaging unless explicitly invited. Now that men have listened and adjusted their behavior accordingly, many are being asked why they are absent. This absence is not limited to romantic relationships, it extends to friendships, community involvement, and social participation as a whole. The average man today has fewer close friends than men did in previous generations. Many men have no close friends at all. Without shared spaces and shared purpose, bonding becomes difficult. Without bonding, isolation grows. At the same time, women have experienced their own form of disconnection. As traditional structures weakened, many traded community based relationships for individual advancement. Families became smaller, neighborhood ties loosened, extended networks faded. While independence increased, long term support systems eroded. The kind of deep, lasting bonds that form between families and communities require time, stability, and shared investment. Those conditions became harder to maintain. As trust declined between men and women, it also declined within groups. Men became cautious not only around women, but around society in general. Women, meanwhile, often found themselves competing rather than cooperating, lacking the same communal ties that once provided resilience and shared responsibility. The result is a society where people are more connected digitally, yet more isolated emotionally than ever before. One of the most damaging shifts during this period was how intimacy and relationships were framed. What was once understood as a shared experience based on trust and mutual respect increasingly became transactional and adversarial. Fear replaced curiosity. Legal and social consequences overshadowed personal connection. Many men concluded that the risks involved in romantic relationships outweighed the benefits, especially when those risks extended beyond emotional harm to reputational and financial damage. This does not mean that healthy relationships are impossible. It means they are rarer, harder to form, and require far more intentional effort than they once did. Many men simply decided that their energy was better spent elsewhere. They focused on work, hobbies, self development, or quiet solitude. They built lives that required little emotional negotiation and offered predictable outcomes. As economic pressures increased, another layer was added to this dynamic. Rising costs of living, housing, food, and basic necessities put stress on everyone. Historically, relationships often formed around shared survival and mutual support. But when trust is low and expectations are mismatched, those pressures amplify existing tensions rather than bringing people together. Now, we see more people openly discussing financial strain and the desire for partnership primarily as a means of stability. This further reinforces men's reluctance to engage. When relationships are framed less as mutual growth and more as economic necessity, the emotional foundation weakens. Men who have learned to live independently are unlikely to step into arrangements that feel one sided or unstable. There is also a generational memory at play. Many men watched older generations navigate difficult relationships, costly separations, and long term consequences. They learned from observation. They internalized the risks and adjusted their goals accordingly. This is not rebellion. It is pattern recognition. Public figures have spoken about this shift for years. One of the most notable voices was Kevin Samuels, who often framed the situation in stark but memorable terms. His message, stripped of theatrics, was fundamentally about accountability, expectations, and reality. Whether people agreed with his tone or not, the underlying themes resonated with many who felt unheard. As society continues to change, the gap between expectation and reality grows. Some still expect men to return to old roles without addressing why those roles were abandoned in the first place. Others insist that nothing is wrong and that this is simply progress unfolding. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. But rising loneliness, declining birth rates, and increasing social fragmentation suggest otherwise. Men who have stepped away are unlikely to return without meaningful change, not because they are unwilling, but because they have built lives that function without constant emotional risk. Solitude, once framed as failure, has become a viable alternative. In that solitude, many have found clarity, stability, and peace. This does not mean society is beyond repair. It does mean that honest conversations are necessary. Blame alone solves nothing. Understanding does. Recognizing how decades of messaging, policy, and cultural pressure reshape behavior is the first step toward rebuilding trust. As conditions become more challenging economically and socially, cooperation becomes more important, not less. But cooperation cannot be demanded. It must be earned through fairness, respect, and shared responsibility. Without those elements, people will continue to withdraw into smaller, safer worlds. Men walking away is not a slogan. It is a description of a behavioral shift that emerged in response to incentives and consequences. Ignoring that reality will not reverse it. Only addressing its causes will. And this conversation is far from over. To understand where we are now, we have to slow down and look carefully at how incentives shape behavior. People like to talk about morality, intentions, and ideals, but societies move based on incentives and consequences. When the cost of an action rises and the reward shrinks, behavior changes. That is not ideology, that is human nature. Men did not wake up one day and collectively decide to disengage. They responded step by step to signals that told them participation was no longer worth the risk. For decades, men were encouraged to be emotionally open, supportive, and engaged, while simultaneously being warned that their words, actions, and even silence could be misinterpreted. This contradiction created an impossible standard: be present, but not too present, be confident, but not assertive. Show interest, but do not initiate. Lead, but do not assume responsibility. Over time, many men realized that no matter how carefully they navigated these rules, the outcome was unpredictable. Predictability matters, stability matters. People need to know what effort leads to what result. When cause and effect break down, people retreat. They simplify their lives. They reduce exposure. That is exactly what happened. Men began narrowing their circles, limiting emotional investment, and prioritizing environments where expectations were clear and consequences were proportional. This shift had a compounding effect. As fewer men participated socially, the remaining interactions carried more weight and more scrutiny. Each mistake became more significant. Each misunderstanding felt amplified. This further discouraged engagement. Eventually, disengagement became normalized, even encouraged among peer groups who shared similar experiences. At the same time, many women were told a very different story. They were told that independence alone was fulfillment, that traditional bonds were optional at best and limiting at worst, that support structures could be replaced by individual success. This message was empowering in the short term, but incomplete in the long term. Independence is valuable, but it is not the same as connection. Autonomy does not replace companionship, community, or shared purpose. As years passed, the gap between expectation and lived experience widened. Many achieved professional success, yet felt emotionally unfulfilled. Others delayed relationships until later in life, assuming time would always be available. But time does not pause. Social skills, trust, and partnership require practice and continuity. When those muscles are not used, they weaken. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable for many people. It requires acknowledging that choices have trade offs. Cultural shifts have costs as well as benefits. Progress in one area can create fragility in another. Denying this reality does not prevent the consequences, it only delays recognition. One of the most overlooked elements in this discussion is how language reshaped perception. Over time, terms that once described rare or extreme behavior became generalized. Broad labels replaced specific context. Intent was deprioritized. Outcome became the only metric that mattered. This created an environment where fear replaced goodwill. People stopped giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Trust cannot exist without goodwill. When goodwill disappears, people protect themselves. Men learn to document, to avoid, to stay quiet. Women learn to assume risk, to remain guarded, and to view interactions through a defensive lens. Neither side emerged healthier from this arrangement. The media played a role as well. Sensational stories, amplified for attention, created distorted impressions of frequency and danger. Rare events were presented as common. Worst case scenarios became the default lens through which interactions were viewed. Fear became profitable. Outrage became currency. Nuance disappeared. In that environment, stepping back felt reasonable. Silence felt safer. Isolation felt manageable. Men who withdrew often discovered that their stress levels dropped. Their lives became simpler. Their routines became predictable. Many realized they did not miss the constant emotional labor that had come to define modern relationships. This realization is rarely discussed honestly. Instead, withdrawal is often framed as bitterness or failure. But for many men, it was neither. It was adaptation. It was choosing peace over chaos. It was opting out of a system that felt stacked against them. As men withdrew, the social ecosystem changed. Dating markets shifted. Expectations remained high while participation declined. This imbalance created frustration on both sides. Women encountered fewer men willing to commit, or men encountered fewer environments where commitment felt safe. This dynamic is reinforced by technology. Online platforms removed the need for proximity while amplifying comparison. People began evaluating potential partners as profiles rather than individuals. This encouraged unrealistic standards and reduced patience. When infinite choice appears available, commitment feels unnecessary. When commitment disappears, trust erodes. Men responded, by disengaging further. Many focused on personal goals, health, financial stability, and hobbies. They formed identities not centered on relationships. They learned to enjoy solitude. Solitude stopped being something to escape and became something to protect. This does not mean men stopped caring. It means they became selective about where they invested that care. Emotional energy became a finite resource rather than an obligation. That shift fundamentally changed relationship dynamics. Meanwhile, economic reality continued to press down on everyone. Rising costs forced difficult decisions. Shared living arrangements became more common, not always out of desire, but necessity. This blurred the line between partnership and survival. When relationships feel transactional, trust weakens further. In previous generations, economic interdependence was paired with strong social norms and community oversight. Today, those safeguards are weaker. Without them, risk increases. Men who watched peers lose years of effort, resources, and stability through broken relationships internalized the lesson. They adjusted expectations downward or walked away entirely. Another factor rarely discussed is how conflict resolution disappeared from public discourse. Disagreement became moral failure rather than difference of perspective. This made honest communication dangerous. People stopped speaking openly. Instead, they curated safe personas and avoided difficult conversations. Healthy relationships require disagreement. They require negotiation. They require tolerance for imperfection. When those traits are discouraged, relationships become fragile. Men learned that honesty could be costly. Silence became the safer option. As this pattern repeated across millions of individuals, the collective effect became visible. Fewer marriages, fewer long term partnerships, declining birth rates, increasing reports of loneliness. These are not isolated statistics, they are signals. Societies depend on stable relationships to function. Families transmit values, provide care, and create continuity. When those structures weaken, pressure shifts to institutions ill equipped to replace them. Governments, corporations, and platforms cannot replicate the emotional resilience of healthy communities. Yet instead of addressing root causes, many narratives focus on symptoms. They ask why men are not participating without asking what made participation unattractive. They criticize withdrawal without examining incentives. This approach guarantees continued decline. Men who have stepped away are often portrayed as selfish or avoidant. But from their perspective, they are simply opting out of a system that offered diminishing returns. They are not demanding change, they are adjusting behavior. This distinction matters. You cannot shame people into trust, you cannot guilt people into vulnerability. Trust grows when conditions support it. Vulnerability appears when safety exists. Without those elements, withdrawal is logical. Women, meanwhile, face their own challenges. Many feel isolated, frustrated, and confused by the shift. They were told they could have everything and now discover that some things require trade offs that were never explained honestly. This realization can feel like betrayal, but resentment helps no one. Blame freezes progress. Understanding opens the door to change. Both sides were shaped by the same cultural forces. Both responded rationally to incentives presented to them. The path forward requires reintroducing honesty into conversations about relationships, expectations, and responsibility. It requires acknowledging mistakes without demonizing entire groups. It requires rebuilding spaces where trust can grow gradually rather than being demanded immediately. Men walking away is not the end of the story, it is a chapter. Whether it becomes a permanent state depends on whether conditions change. Men will not return simply because they are asked to. They will return when engagement makes sense again. That means clear norms, fair standards, proportional consequences, mutual respect, and perhaps most importantly, the restoration of goodwill. Without goodwill, no amount of messaging will fix what is broken. The longer society avoids these conversations, the more entrenched withdrawal becomes. People build lives around absence. They structure routines that do not rely on partnership. Over time, reentry feels unnecessary. This is the quiet transformation underway. Not loud protests or dramatic confrontations, but silent disengagement, a collective decision to choose stability over uncertainty. And this transformation does not reverse itself automatically. It requires deliberate effort, it requires humility, it requires recognizing that progress without balance creates fragility. As we move forward into increasingly uncertain economic and social conditions, cooperation will matter more than ever. But cooperation cannot be forced. It emerges when people believe participation is worthwhile. Men have shown what happens when that belief disappears. The question now is whether society is willing to learn from that signal or whether it will continue pretending nothing has changed. This is not about going backward. It is about restoring what was lost in the rush forward: connection, trust, shared responsibility. Without those elements, no society can thrive. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth many prefer to avoid. The current state of disconnection is not sustainable. It will either be addressed intentionally or it will continue to degrade until the costs become impossible to ignore. The choice remains open, but time does not wait. One of the hardest realities for people to accept is that large scale social shifts do not reverse because of complaints or nostalgia. They reverse only when conditions change in a meaningful way. Right now, the conditions that pushed men to disengage are still firmly in place. In some cases, they have intensified. This is why calls for men to simply return, to try harder, or to be more understanding fall flat. Those appeals ignore the lived experience that shaped current behavior. When men talk privately about why they stepped back, the themes are remarkably consistent. They talk about exhaustion. They talk about constantly having to monitor their words and actions. They talk about feeling disposable rather than valued. They talk about giving effort without receiving appreciation or security in return. Over time, those experiences add up, and eventually a threshold is crossed. That threshold is quiet. There is no announcement, no confrontation, just a decision to stop trying. From the outside, it looks like apathy. From the inside, it feels like relief. That relief is powerful, and once experienced, it is difficult to give up. Many people assume that loneliness will eventually drive men back into the system. That assumption misunderstands the nature of modern isolation. Solitude today is not the same as isolation in the past. Technology, hobbies, and flexible work allow people to construct fulfilling lives with minimal social dependency. Men can socialize selectively, engage on their own terms, and retreat when necessary. The pressure to conform is lower than it once was. This does not mean men no longer desire connection. It means they desire connection without chaos. They want clarity instead of confusion, respect instead of suspicion, cooperation instead of constant negotiation. When those elements are missing, solitude becomes preferable. Another overlooked aspect of this shift is how risk is distributed. In previous generations, risk in relationships was more evenly shared. Today, many men perceive that the downside risk is disproportionately theirs to bear. Whether that perception is fully accurate or not is almost beside the point. Behavior responds to perception. If people believe the risk is asymmetric, they will avoid exposure. This perception has been reinforced repeatedly through stories, examples, and personal observation. Men watch peers lose homes, savings, access to children, and years of progress. They see reputations damaged beyond repair, over misunderstandings or accusations that are impossible to fully disprove. Each story adds another layer of caution. The result is not hostility, it is disengagement. Men are not marching in protest, they are quietly opting out. They are building lives that minimize vulnerability. They are choosing predictability over passion. And as this pattern spreads, it reshapes expectations across society. Women encounter men who are polite but distant, friendly but non-committal, present but emotionally guarded. This creates confusion because it contradicts older narratives about male behavior. The scripts no longer match reality. Some respond to this confusion by doubling down on blame. Others respond by trying to shame men into participation. Neither approach works. Shame accelerates withdrawal. Blame entrenches division. What is needed is a recalibration of expectations on both sides. That recalibration starts with honesty. Honest conversations about what people want, what they are willing to offer, and what they are willing to risk. It requires abandoning slogans and confronting trade offs. It requires acknowledging that freedom and security often exist in tension. For decades, society emphasized freedom without fully explaining the cost. Freedom from roles, freedom from obligation, freedom from expectations. Those freedoms felt liberating, but they also removed structure. Without structure, trust becomes harder to sustain. Structure is not oppression, it is a framework that allows cooperation. Clear roles and norms reduce ambiguity. They allow people to understand what is expected and what is rewarded. When structure disappears, everyone must negotiate constantly. Negotiation is exhausting. Men learned that constant negotiation drained their energy. They learned that ambiguity made mistakes inevitable. Rather than continuing to navigate unclear terrain, many chose to exit. Women, meanwhile, were told that structure was unnecessary or limiting. Many embraced flexibility and independence. But flexibility without coordination creates instability. Independence without cooperation creates fragmentation. Over time, those outcomes became impossible to ignore. Now we see the results in declining participation across multiple areas of life. Civic engagement drops. Community involvement weakens. Informal support networks disappear. Institutions struggle to fill the gap. The social fabric thins. This thinning has emotional consequences. People feel disconnected even when surrounded by others. Conversations feel shallow. Trust feels fragile. Many express a sense that something important is missing, even if they cannot name it. Men walking away is part of that missing piece. Not because men are inherently more valuable, but because disengagement at scale alters balance. Societies rely on participation. When large groups disengage, the system destabilizes. It is tempting to frame this as a battle between genders. That framing is misleading and unproductive. This is not a war, it is a misalignment. Both sides responded to incentives presented to them. Both are now dealing with unintended consequences. The challenge is that reversing misalignment requires humility. It requires admitting that some widely accepted ideas did not produce the outcomes promised. It requires letting go of narratives that no longer fit reality. This is difficult because narratives become identity. Questioning them feels like a personal attack. As a result, many people cling to explanations that blame others rather than examining the system itself. Men who have disengaged often feel misunderstood. Their silence is interpreted as indifference or resentment. In truth, many still care deeply. They simply no longer see a safe path to engage. Women who feel abandoned often feel betrayed. They were told men would adapt indefinitely. That belief shaped expectations. When reality diverged, frustration followed. Both experiences are valid. Neither is solved by denial. Another layer to this issue is how conflict is handled. Modern discourse often discourages disagreement. People are expected to align perfectly or remain silent. This makes it difficult to address problems early when they are manageable. Instead, resentment builds until withdrawal seems like the only option. Healthy systems allow friction. They allow disagreement without punishment. They allow repair after mistakes. When those mechanisms disappear, exit becomes the only relief valve. Men learned that repair was not guaranteed. Apologies were not always accepted. Context was not always considered. Once trust was broken, it was rarely restored. Faced with permanent consequences, men chose caution. This caution extended beyond romantic relationships into professional and social life. Men became more reserved at work, more careful in mentorship, more distant in casual interactions. This reduced opportunities for connection across the board. The long term cost of this caution is still unfolding. Reduced mentorship affects career development, reduced collaboration affects innovation, reduced trust affects productivity. These effects compound over time. Yet discussions about these trends often remain superficial. They focus on symptoms rather than causes. They ask why people are unhappy without asking why systems feel unsafe. As economic pressures increase, these issues become more acute. Stress reduces patience. Uncertainty amplifies fear. In such conditions, people retreat further into safe zones. Men who have already disengaged are unlikely to reverse course under added pressure. This is why appeals to nostalgia fail. You cannot recreate past dynamics under present conditions. The world has changed. Technology has changed. Expectations have changed. Any solution must account for that reality. Rebuilding trust requires gradual steps. It requires environments where risk is shared, where mistakes are proportionate, where intentions matter, where accountability exists on all sides. It also requires patience. Trust does not return quickly once broken. People who have reorganized their lives around independence will not suddenly abandon that stability. Men walking away is not a protest movement that ends with concessions. It is an adaptive response that persists until conditions improve. That is why it feels so difficult to address. There is no leader to negotiate with, no demands to meet, just behavior responding to incentives. If society wants engagement, it must make engagement worthwhile. That means reducing risk, clarifying norms, and restoring goodwill. Without those changes, disengagement will continue quietly. The danger of ignoring this reality is not dramatic collapse, it is slow erosion, declining participation, weakening bonds, increasing isolation. These trends do not make headlines, but they shape the future. Every generation inherits the social structures left by the previous one. If those structures are fragile, rebuilding becomes harder. Children grow up without models for cooperation. They learn independence, but not interdependence. This is why the conversation matters. Not to assign blame, but to understand trajectory. To recognize that choices made today shape conditions tomorrow. Men who have stepped away are not enemies of progress, they are indicators. They show what happens when systems become inhospitable. Ignoring indicators does not change outcomes. The path forward is uncertain, but not impossible. It begins with listening rather than lecturing, with examining incentives rather than repeating slogans, with rebuilding trust slowly rather than demanding it instantly. Whether society chooses that path remains to be seen. What is clear is that the current trajectory leads to deeper fragmentation, and fragmentation serves no one. As this reality becomes harder to ignore, more people will begin asking difficult questions. Why connection feels rare? Why trust feels fragile? Why solitude feels safer than partnership? Those questions deserve honest answers, and those answers require courage. Courage is the missing ingredient in most public conversations about this subject. Not the loud kind that seeks attention, but the quiet kind that allows people to confront uncomfortable truths without immediately reaching for excuses. It takes courage to admit that systems can fail even when intentions were good. It takes courage to admit that slogans replace wisdom and that complexity was sacrificed for simplicity. For a long time, people were encouraged to think in absolutes: good and bad, right and wrong, oppressor and oppressed. These frameworks may work in limited contexts, but when applied broadly to human relationships, they distort reality. Relationships are not ideological battlefields, they are fragile, personal, and deeply influenced by incentives, trust, and mutual understanding. When ideology enters relationships, flexibility disappears. People stop responding to individuals and start responding to categories. Once that happens, empathy declines. Men become symbols rather than people. Women become narratives rather than individuals. Real connection becomes difficult because everyone is defending a position instead of listening. Men who walked away often describe reaching a moment of clarity, a point where they realize that no matter how much they explained themselves, they were not being heard as individuals. Their experiences were filtered through assumptions. Their intentions were judged through suspicion. That realization is deeply demotivating. Once a person feels unseen, engagement becomes performative. They go through motions without investing emotionally. Eventually, even that becomes too exhausting. Withdrawal follows. This withdrawal is often misunderstood as a rejection of responsibility. In reality, many men who disengaged still meet their obligations. They work, they pay taxes, they contribute economically. What they stopped doing was volunteering their emotional labor into environments that felt hostile or unpredictable. Emotional labor is rarely discussed honestly. It is often expected, but seldom acknowledged. Listening, supporting, initiating, planning, taking emotional risks. These actions require energy. When that energy is met with suspicion or dismissal, people stop offering it. Women, on the other hand, were encouraged to assert boundaries and prioritize self interest. Boundaries are healthy, self respect is necessary, but boundaries without bridges create isolation. When both sides protect themselves without building trust, connection collapses. The tragedy is that many people wanted similar things: stability, respect, companionship, growth, but the frameworks used to pursue those goals push people apart rather than bringing them together. Another factor that accelerated disengagement was the erosion of shared meaning. In previous generations, relationships were embedded within broader narratives: family, community, faith, shared responsibility. These narratives provided context and guidance. They helped people navigate conflict and compromise. As those narratives weakened, relationships became self contained projects, two individuals negotiating everything from scratch. Without shared reference points, negotiation became constant. Constant negotiation is exhausting. Men who value efficiency and predictability found this particularly draining. They preferred systems with clear rules and outcomes. When relationships lacked those qualities, disengagement felt rational. This does not mean men are incapable of emotional depth. It means they require conditions that make emotional investment worthwhile. Chaos repels commitment, stability invites it. The modern environment often celebrates disruption, change, breaking norms. While innovation has benefits, constant disruption undermines trust. People cannot build long term plans in unstable environments. They retreat to short term strategies. Men adapted by shortening horizons. They focused on what they could control today rather than investing in uncertain futures. Long term commitments became optional rather than expected. As this mindset spread, it influenced younger generations. Boys observed older men opting out and internalized the lesson. They learned caution early. They learned to prioritize independence. They learned to avoid vulnerability. This generational transmission is significant. Once behaviors become normalized, reversing them becomes harder. Each cohort inherits the adaptations of the previous one. This is why dismissing men walking away as a temporary phase is misguided. It is a structural shift. It reflects learned behavior reinforced over time. Technology amplified this learning. Online communities allowed men to share experiences, compare notes, and validate decisions. What once felt like individual failure was reframed as collective pattern recognition. This validation reduced shame. Men realized they were not alone. They realized their experiences were common. This reinforced disengagement. At the same time, technology provided alternatives to traditional social structures. Entertainment, gaming, online learning, remote work. These options reduced reliance on local communities. People could meet needs without proximity. Reduced proximity weakened accountability. In small communities, behavior has consequences. Reputation matters. In large, anonymous systems, consequences diffuse. Trust erodes. Men who valued accountability noticed this shift. They saw systems where responsibility was unclear and outcomes unpredictable. Again, withdrawal made sense. Economic volatility added another layer. When futures feel uncertain, people become risk averse. Relationships, especially long term ones, represent risk. Men who already perceived asymmetry in risk became even more cautious. This caution is often misinterpreted as lack of ambition or fear. In reality, it is strategic. It reflects adaptation to uncertainty. As costs rise and security feels fragile, people narrow focus. They protect what they have. They avoid entanglements that could destabilize their lives. Women facing similar pressures often desire partnership for shared stability. This creates tension when one side seeks security through connection and the other seeks security through autonomy. Both responses are understandable. Together, they create friction. This friction is exacerbated by messaging that frames disagreement as moral failure. When people cannot discuss differences openly, resentment grows. Withdrawal becomes attractive. Another overlooked aspect is how public shaming altered behavior. Mistakes that once led to private correction now lead to public condemnation. This discourages experimentation and honesty. Men learned that mistakes could follow them indefinitely. In such environments, perfection becomes the expectation. Perfection is impossible. Faced with impossible standards, people disengage. This disengagement is quiet but widespread. It shows up in declining participation across domains. Fewer people volunteer, fewer mentor, fewer lead. Leadership requires risk. When risk is punished disproportionately, leadership disappears. Men historically filled many informal leadership roles: coaches, mentors, organizers. As they withdrew, gaps emerged. These gaps are not easily filled because they require trust and continuity. Institutions attempted to compensate, but formal structures cannot replace informal bonds. Policies cannot substitute for goodwill. Programs cannot manufacture trust. As these gaps widen, people feel less supported. Loneliness increases. Anxiety rises. Yet, the underlying causes remain unaddressed. Addressing them requires reintroducing proportionality. Mistakes must be met with correction, not destruction. Intent must matter. Context must be considered. Without these principles, people will continue to protect themselves through withdrawal. Men walking away is a rational response to disproportionate consequences. Until proportionality returns, engagement will remain limited. This does not mean tolerating harm or ignoring accountability. It means calibrating responses to reality. It means allowing learning and repair. Repair is essential. Without pathways to repair, relationships end at the first fracture. Over time, people stop trying to build them, and men who disengaged often cite the absence of repair mechanisms. Once labeled, they felt permanently defined. Without forgiveness, effort felt pointless. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is a social technology that allows continuity. When forgiveness disappears, fragmentation follows. The modern reluctance to forgive reflects fear. Fear of being seen as condoning harm. Fear of losing moral standing. This fear undermines resilience. Resilient systems absorb shocks. Fragile systems shatter. Current social dynamics favor fragility. Men adapted by avoiding shocks altogether. They minimized exposure. They chose controlled environments. This choice reshaped identity. Men found meaning in mastery, skill development, physical fitness, financial independence. These pursuits offered measurable progress and predictable rewards. Relationships, by contrast, felt ambiguous. Progress was unclear, rewards uncertain, costs potentially high. Over time, priorities shifted. What was once central became optional. This shift is not inherently negative. Independence has value. Self sufficiency builds confidence. But when independence replaces interdependence entirely, societies weaken. Interdependence requires trust. Trust requires shared norms. Shared norms require agreement. Agreement requires dialogue. Dialogue requires openness. At each stage, breakdown occurred. Openness declined. Dialogue became risky. Agreement fragmented, norms dissolved. Rebuilding any one of these elements in isolation is insufficient. They reinforce each other. Addressing one requires addressing all. This is why surface level solutions fail. Encouraging people to date more does nothing if trust is absent. Promoting positivity does nothing if incentives remain misaligned. The conversation must move deeper. It must address structure, incentives, and consequences. Men walking away is feedback. It signals that current structures discourage engagement. Ignoring feedback does not improve systems. The longer feedback is ignored, the more entrenched behaviors become. People adapt further, habits solidify, expectations reset. Eventually, re engagement feels unnatural. People forget how to connect deeply. Skills atrophy. This is already happening. Many struggle with basic communication. Conversations feel scripted. Authenticity feels risky. Reversing this trend requires patience and humility. It requires acknowledging that some cultural experiments produced unintended harm. It requires willingness to adjust. Adjustment is not regression, it is refinement. The future depends on whether society can refine its approach to relationships, whether it can balance freedom with responsibility, whether it can restore proportionality and goodwill. Men have shown what happens when balance is lost. They withdraw. Whether they return depends on what comes next. What comes next will determine whether this period becomes a temporary correction or a permanent fracture. History shows that societies can recover from disconnection, but only when they confront causes honestly rather than masking them with slogans. Recovery does not come from forcing people back into roles they no longer trust. It comes from rebuilding conditions that make participation worthwhile again. One of the most uncomfortable realizations for many people is that trust cannot be mandated. You cannot legislate it. You cannot shame people into it. You cannot demand it through moral pressure. Trust grows slowly when people observe consistency over time. It grows when words match actions and when consequences feel fair. For years, many men felt that the rules of engagement were constantly changing. What was acceptable one moment became unacceptable the next. Guidance was vague. Enforcement was inconsistent. In such an environment, Even well intentioned people hesitate. They choose silence over speech, distance over closeness. Silence, however, has a cost. It reduces understanding, it allows assumptions to fill the gap. Over time, silence hardens into separation. Separation becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Men who identify as independent often take pride in self control and resilience. These traits served them well during disengagement. They learned to manage emotions internally rather than seeking external validation. They built routines that provided structure without reliance on others. This self regulation is often misread as emotional coldness. In reality, it is containment. Men learned to contain vulnerability because expressing it felt unsafe. Containment preserves function but limits intimacy. Intimacy requires exposure. Exposure requires safety. Without safety, containment dominates. Women navigating the same environment often experienced a different but related challenge. They were encouraged to assert independence while also being told that partnership would eventually appear. When partnership did not materialize, confusion followed. Many found themselves balancing professional demands with unmet emotional needs. The disconnect between expectation and outcome produced frustration. Some responded by raising standards, assuming quality would emerge through selectivity. Others responded by withdrawing emotionally, mirroring male disengagement in different ways. These parallel withdrawals created a standoff, each side protecting itself, each side interpreting the other's caution as rejection. Communication stalled. When communication stalls, narratives replace dialogue. People tell stories about the other side rather than speaking with them. These stories often exaggerate extremes. They simplify complexity. They harden positions. Narratives are powerful. They shape perception. Once internalized, they influence behavior. Men who believe engagement is dangerous behave cautiously. Women who believe men are unreliable behave defensively. Each behavior reinforces the other's belief. Breaking the cycle requires interrupting narratives with experience, positive interactions, low risk exchanges, gradual trust building. None of these occur easily in environments dominated by fear and judgment. Another challenge is that modern culture often celebrates extremes. Moderate voices receive less attention. Balanced perspectives are drowned out by outrage. This distorts understanding. People come to believe that extreme positions are normal. Men observing this landscape conclude that reasoned engagement is unlikely to be rewarded. Loud conflict dominates, nuance disappears. Again, withdrawal feels sensible. At the same time, institutions that once mediated conflict have weakened. Families are smaller, communities less cohesive, workplaces more transient. Without mediators, disagreements escalate or dissolve relationships entirely. This places enormous pressure on individuals to manage complex emotional dynamics alone. Many are not equipped for this. They retreat. Retreat, however, does not solve underlying issues, it postpones them. Over time, postponed issues accumulate, loneliness increases, purpose fades. People function but do not flourish. Men who withdrew often filled this gap with projects, building, learning, training. These pursuits offer feedback and progress. They provide meaning without relational risk. Meaning is essential. People will choose environments that offer it reliably. If relationships do not offer meaning without disproportionate cost, alternatives will prevail. The question society must confront is not why men walked away, but why walking away made sense. That question shifts focus from blame to structure. Structure includes laws, norms, media narratives, economic incentives, and social expectations. All of these shape behavior. Adjusting structure changes outcomes. One structural issue is the imbalance between responsibility and authority. Men were often expected to shoulder responsibility without corresponding authority or respect. Responsibility without authority breeds resentment. Authority without responsibility breeds chaos. Balance matters. In many areas, balance was lost. Men were expected to contribute while being told their perspectives were outdated or unwelcome. Over time, they stopped contributing beyond what was required. Another issue is how success is defined. For years, success was framed almost exclusively in individual terms: personal achievement, personal fulfillment, personal freedom. Collective success was de emphasized. Relationships, however, are collective projects. They require sacrifice, compromise, shared goals. When culture prioritizes individual gratification, collective projects suffer. Men who value efficiency recognize this mismatch. They saw that investing in collective projects without shared commitment was inefficient. They adjusted accordingly. Women faced a similar tension. Individual empowerment clashed with relational interdependence. Navigating both without guidance proved difficult. This lack of guidance is critical. Previous generations relied on traditions to navigate transitions. Modern culture dismantled many traditions without replacing them with functional alternatives. The absence of replacement left people improvising. Improvisation works temporarily. Long term, it produces inconsistency. Inconsistent experiences undermine trust. Trust requires reliability. Reliability requires structure. Reintroducing structure does not mean returning to outdated norms. It means creating new norms that acknowledge current realities while providing clarity. Clarity reduces anxiety. Anxiety drives withdrawal. One area where clarity is desperately needed is expectations around commitment. Ambiguity benefits no one. When commitment is undefined, people hesitate. Men in particular avoid unclear commitments because of perceived risk. Clear stages, clear boundaries, clear expectations, these reduce fear. They allow people to assess risk realistically. Another area is accountability. Accountability must be reciprocal. When only one side feels accountable, resentment builds. Reciprocal accountability restores balance. Media narratives often distort accountability by focusing on extremes. Everyday positive interactions are invisible. Failures are amplified. This skews perception. Correcting perception requires highlighting ordinary success, stable relationships, cooperative interactions, repair after conflict. These examples demonstrate possibility. Unfortunately, stable success is less sensational. It does not generate clicks. As a result, it receives less attention. Men walking away is partly a reaction to this distorted information environment. When negative outcomes dominate attention, risk appears omnipresent. Addressing this requires media literacy. People must learn to contextualize stories, to recognize rarity, to avoid generalizing extremes. Education can help, but only if it is honest. Sanitized messaging erodes trust. People sense when reality is glossed over. Honesty includes acknowledging pain on all sides. Men experienced marginalization. Women experienced insecurity. Both suffered from unrealistic narratives. Healing requires mutual recognition. Recognition does not mean agreement, it means acknowledgement. Acknowledgement lowers defenses. Defenses block connection. Lowering defenses creates space for dialogue. Dialogue allows recalibration. Recalibration does not guarantee harmony, it improves odds. Another challenge is time horizon. Many people expect quick solutions. Cultural shifts unfold slowly. Rebuilding trust takes years, not months. Men who disengaged will not re engage en masse because of one conversation or policy. They will observe changes over time. Consistency matters. This patience requirement frustrates those seeking immediate results. They may interpret caution as refusal. It is not, it is evaluation. Men evaluating a re engagement look for signals: fair treatment, balanced accountability, clear norms, opportunities for repair. Without these signals, disengagement persists. Economic stability also plays a role. Financial insecurity amplifies caution. As long as economic pressure remains high, risk tolerance remains low. Policies that reduce economic volatility indirectly support relational stability. When people feel secure materially, they are more willing to invest emotionally. This connection is often overlooked. Relationship health is tied to economic health. Ignoring this link leads to misplaced blame. People blame attitudes rather than conditions. Conditions shape attitudes. Men walking away is an attitude shaped by conditions. Changing the attitude requires changing the conditions. The alternative is continued fragmentation, more people living parallel lives, more isolation disguised as independence. Independence is valuable, but isolation is corrosive. Humans are social. Even those who value solitude need connection. Men who disengaged often maintain limited connections: friends, family, select communities. They did not become hermits, they became selective. Selectivity is not rejection, it is filtration. Understanding this distinction matters. Men are not rejecting society entirely, they are rejecting aspects that feel unsafe or unfair. Reforming those aspects invites participation. Reforming requires collaboration. Collaboration requires trust. Trust requires consistency. Consistency requires commitment. Commitment requires belief that effort will be met with fairness. This chain is fragile. Breaking any link weakens the whole. Rebuilding it is possible, but only if society accepts responsibility for past missteps. That acceptance does not require self condemnation, it requires maturity. Mature systems learn from feedback, they adjust, they improve. Men walking away is feedback. It should be studied, not dismissed. The longer it is dismissed, the more normalized disengagement becomes. Normalization reduces urgency. Urgency fades. Eventually, disengagement becomes the default. Re engagement becomes the exception. At that point, rebuilding becomes far harder. This is why the current moment matters, not as a crisis to panic over, but as a signal to reflect. Reflection is uncomfortable. It challenges identity. It questions assumptions. But without reflection, repetition follows. Repetition entrenches patterns, patterns become destiny. Society still has agency. Choices remain. Structures can be adjusted. Norms can evolve. Men have shown what happens when engagement is discouraged. They step back. Whether they step forward again depends on what they see next. The final stage of this conversation is not about prediction or warning, but about clarity. After everything that has been said, stripped of emotion, stripped of slogans, stripped of nostalgia, what remains is a simple reality that cannot be negotiated away. Human connection does not collapse because people suddenly forget how to care. It collapses when the systems that once rewarded care begin to punish it. When that happens repeatedly, people adapt, not out of spite, but out of self preservation. Men walking away was not a movement built on anger, it was a pattern built on learning. Learning what led to stability and what led to unnecessary risk, learning which environments rewarded effort and which ones quietly drained it, learning where peace could be found and where it could not. What many people still struggle to accept is that withdrawal does not always come from resentment. Often it comes from exhaustion. When someone has tried repeatedly, adjusted repeatedly, apologized repeatedly, and still feels like the ground keeps shifting beneath them, eventually they stop asking what they can do better and start asking whether participation makes sense at all. That moment is not dramatic, it is quiet. It happens internally. It looks like a man deciding not to respond to a message, not to pursue a conversation, not to invest emotionally where the outcome feels uncertain. Multiply that decision by millions, and you begin to understand why society feels hollow in ways people cannot easily explain. The most dangerous misunderstanding is assuming that this withdrawal will reverse on its own. It will not. Habits formed under pressure do not dissolve when pressure remains. Men who reorganized their lives around independence did not do so temporarily. They built routines, identities, and expectations that function without relational dependency. They learned to regulate emotions internally, to seek fulfillment in work, learning, health, and controlled social environments. Once those systems are in place, returning to uncertainty feels irrational rather than romantic. This is why appeals to emotion, guilt, or nostalgia fail. They do not address structure, they do not change incentives, they do not reduce risk. At the same time, many women are discovering that independence without connection carries its own cost. Autonomy can sustain a person, but it does not replace shared meaning. Careers can provide purpose, but they do not replace companionship. Financial stability can reduce stress, but it does not replace emotional safety. These realizations are arriving late for some and painfully for others. Yet frustration alone cannot reverse the past. What matters now is whether lessons are learned or ignored. Ignored lessons repeat themselves. Learned lessons reshape behavior. The conversation cannot move forward if it remains trapped in blame. Blame freezes people in defensive positions. It turns every discussion into a trial rather than a problem solving effort. Understanding does not mean excusing harm, it means recognizing cause and effect. It means admitting that cultural experiments have consequences and that some of those consequences are now visible in loneliness, mistrust, and fragmentation. Men walking away is not an ideology, it is a symptom. Treating the symptom without addressing the cause guarantees recurrence. The path forward, if one exists, will not look like the past. It will not be a return to old scripts or rigid roles. It will require new norms built on clarity, proportionality, and mutual accountability. It will require environments where intent matters, where mistakes can be corrected without permanent destruction, where trust can grow gradually rather than being demanded instantly. It will require patience because trust broken over decades cannot be rebuilt in months. And it will require humility because no side emerged from this shift without misjudgments. Men are not waiting to be convinced that connection is valuable. They already know that. What they are waiting for is evidence that engagement will be met with fairness rather than suspicion, stability rather than chaos, respect rather than dismissal. They are watching behavior, not listening to speeches. They are observing patterns, not promises. Until those patterns change, disengagement remains the rational choice. And as economic pressures increase and uncertainty deepens, these dynamics will matter even more. Stress reduces tolerance for risk. In such conditions, people retreat further into what they can control. That is why this moment matters. Not because society is on the brink of collapse tomorrow, but because the trajectory is being set quietly through everyday choices made by individuals who no longer feel safe investing in shared futures. This conversation is not meant to inspire anger or bitterness. It is meant to inspire realism. Realism about how people respond to incentives. Realism about how trust is built and destroyed. Realism about the cost of ignoring feedback. Men walking away was feedback. It signaled that something fundamental was misaligned. Whether that signal is heeded or dismissed will shape what comes next. If there is to be rebuilding, it will begin not with demands, but with consistency. Not with slogans, but with behavior. Not with moral pressure, but with structural change. Rebuilding connection requires making connection make sense again. It requires environments where cooperation is rewarded, where accountability is shared, and where goodwill is allowed to exist without being treated as weakness. And that brings us to the final question that everyone must answer for themselves. Do we continue pretending that nothing went wrong and hope people return out of obligation, or do we confront the reality that people left because leaving worked? Men found peace in solitude not because they rejected society, but because society rejected the conditions that made connection safe. Until that changes, silence will remain louder than outrage, absence more powerful than argument, and withdrawal more appealing than risk. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Or do you see parts of it reflected in your own life or the lives of people around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation is bigger than one video and it matters that people speak honestly about it. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.